The brass key is still warm in her palm when the door latches behind her. She does not knock. She does not turn around. She stands in the trampled snow and looks at the one thing they let her keep, a dead man's tool chest, one corner already going under the snow that blows sideways off the pass. On the laundry line, a frozen dish towel turns in the wind like a plank of wood. The girl is 16. Behind her is a warm room she can have back tonight if she puts her mark on the paper in the agent's gloved hand. She looks at the paper. Then she lifts the chest and turns toward the trees. The brass room key was still warm in her palm when the boarding house door latched behind her. Minta Dyer stood in the trampled snow of the Red Mountain camp and did not move. Behind her, the door. In front of her, her father's tool chest dropped where Merritt Sloan's men had left it, one corner already going under the white that came sideways off the pass. A dish towel had frozen stiff on the laundry line, and it turned in the wind like a plank of wood. Her father had been dead 9 weeks. Clement Dyer had gone into the stope on a morning in September to reset a bad run of timbers, and the roof came down before he could drive the last wedge. The company paid what a mine carpenter's death was worth, which was a burial and a line ruled under his name in the store ledger. By the time the account was closed, the coffin, the plot, the flour, and the coffee he had bought on credit while he still breathed. There was nothing left but the chest and the girl. Now the girl had nothing but the chest. She counted what she had because counting was the only thing that hour that felt like work. $1.85. 2 wool blankets, both worn thin, 1 oilcloth ground sheet, 28 feet of manila rope her father had coiled with his own hands, a hammer, a cold chisel, an auger, a hatchet, a handsaw, and a ball of measuring twine knotted at the intervals he had taught her. Food for 4 days if she was hard about it. No cabin, no stove, no relative within 300 miles who would answer a letter, and no coin to post one. She could not walk out, either. The wagon road down to Ouray was already glazed, and the drops off its outer edge did not forgive a slip. She had no fare for the stage and no boots for the distance, and Sloan had seen to the rest. He had told the stage contractor that Clement Dyer left debts, which meant no driver would carry the debtor's daughter down the mountain on the chance he might be asked to answer for it. The next freight wagon that took passengers cheap would not climb the pass again until the spring thaw opened the grade. Spring was 5 months of winter away. Minta was 16 years old, and she had until dark to decide where she would not freeze. She hauled the chest to the lee of the assay office, out of the worst of the wind, and sat on it, and made herself think the way her father had taught her to think when a set of timbers looked wrong. Not all at once, one question at a time. What kills you first, and what kills you slow? Cold killed first. Hunger killed slow. So the first problem was walls. That was when Byram Keene found her. Keene was the shift foreman, a square man of 52, with more than 20 winters in Western camps written into the cracks of his face. He was not a cruel man. He stopped in front of her with his hands pushed into his coat and looked at the chest and the rope and the blankets, and he did the same arithmetic she had done, only faster, because he had watched it happen to other people. "You've heard the offer," he said. "I've heard it." "Then you know what I'm going to say." Keene crouched, so his eyes were level with hers, and when he spoke again there was no meanness in it, only the flat weight of a man reading the ground. "A shack is not shelter. You take one of the empty ones and you still need a roof that holds snow load, a stove, 6 foot of pipe, chinking in every seam, and a winter's fuel cut and stacked before the hard cold. 6 cords minimum for one small room. You have blankets where a household needs walls. You have 4 meals where winter asks for 4 months." "The empty cabins," Minta said. "There are 3 above the tram." "One's claimed. One's got a sprung ridge that'll take the roof off in the first big load. And the third sits square under a slide path that ran in 91 and will run again. He said it the way a man tells you the stove is hot. There's no free house on this mountain, girl. There never was. She looked at the snow between her boots. You came to tell me to sign. Keen stood, and his knees cracked, and he did not deny it. Sloane had sent him, or Sloane had made it easy for him to come, which amounted to the same thing. There's a dry corner in the washroom behind the boilers, he said. Warm as anywhere in the camp. Sloane will let you have it through the winter. You only have to put your mark on the settlement. The settlement. Minta knew every word of it because Sloane had read it to her twice, slow, as though the slowness were a kindness. The settlement said that Clement Dyer's final wages were forgiven against his debts, that his daughter made no claim on them and none on his tools, and that the company owed the Dyer name nothing at all. Sign it, and she had a warm corner. Sign it, and her father's last 3 months of pay, money she was almost certain he had earned and never seen, belonged to Merritt Sloane forever, along with the chest she was sitting on. No, she said. Keen's jaw worked. He was not surprised, and he was not pleased. Then I've done what I came to do, he said, and I'll tell you the last of it for nothing. Nobody sleeps well who sleeps alone in these mountains in December, and nobody sleeps at all who's got no place to sleep. You've got till dark. After that, the cold doesn't argue. He walked back toward the mine, and the wind closed over the sound of his boots. She slept that first night in an abandoned powder shed at the edge of the workings, and she slept there only after she had pried up 2 floor planks with the cold chisel and made certain no forgotten box of explosive sat waiting under the frost. The shed had 4 walls, and most of a roof and gaps between the planks wide enough to pass a finger. Wind came through the gaps in thin white ribbons and laid them across the floor. She wrapped herself in both blankets and the oilcloth and lay against the tool chest for the little warmth its bulk turned back. And still the cold came up through the boards and into her hips and her heels and would not leave. She did not sleep so much as she waited in short pieces, with the waiting broken by the cold every time it found a new way in. Toward morning she could not feel 2 toes on her right foot, and she took the boot off and held the foot in her hands under the blanket until the feeling came back as pain, which was better than the alternative. Her knuckles had cracked and wept in the dry air. When she finally stood, her whole body had the ache of a thing that had been clenched all night, and her stomach turned on nothing because she had eaten 1/3 of what she meant to, and it had not been much. 4 walls and a roof, and it had nearly finished her in a single November night. She understood then, in her body and not just in the ledger, what Keen had meant. Walls were not the answer. Walls this thin were only a slower kind of open air. She went looking for firewood, because a person without a stove still needs to eat and to melt snow, and because moving was warmer than not moving. She worked her way down the slope below an old prospect cut where deadfall sometimes gathered, and she was bent over dragging a broken spruce limb free of the drift when she noticed the ground. There was a place where the snow did not lie right. It was a fissure in the bedrock, a crack maybe 2 feet across at the mouth, running down into the dark at a slant. All around it the snow lay smooth and deep, but across the opening itself the snow was thin, scoured, uneven, as if something were breathing up out of the mountain and would not let the drift settle. She stood over it and felt the cold air of the morning against her face, and then, when she leaned close, she felt something else. From one side of the crack, the eastern wall, came a breath that was not cold. It was faint, and it was damp, and it carried a smell she knew from deep in the workings where her father had taken her as a child, the wet iron, mineral smell of stone that water has moved through for a long time. Cold air should sink into a hole like that and lie there. Every miner in the camp knew a deep crack for what it was, a trap that gathered the cold and held it, a place that grew ice in July. That was the sense of it, and the sense of it was correct. So why was air rising out of one wall of this one and rising warm? She did not have an answer. She had a question, and the question would not leave her alone. Minta spent 3 days on the fissure before she let herself believe anything, because her father had beaten belief without proof out of her early. Belief was how a man set a bad timber and told himself it would hold. Proof was how a man came home. She borrowed 2 cheap spirit thermometers from Lyda Rourke, the boarding house cook, and she rigged them to her measuring line, and she lowered them into the crack at the knotted intervals and left them and drew them up and read them and wrote the readings on the inside of the tool chest lid in charcoal. She did it in the gray light of morning and again in the failing light of afternoon so she could see how the numbers moved with the day. The numbers told a story, and the story was strange. At the lip, the readings followed the surface, rising and falling with the sun and the wind, no shelter in them at all. At 8 feet down, the swings were smaller, but still there. But at about 15 feet against that eastern wall, the mercury settled into the low 40s and stayed there, morning and afternoon alike, as though it had stopped listening to the sky. Below 30 feet, the story turned again. The numbers slid down toward freezing, and the line came up beaded with damp and once with a skin of ice on the brass. And at a narrow seam, maybe 26 feet down, where that warm breath came from, a thermometer left through the night read close to 50 degrees at dawn, higher than anything above it. She sat with the charcoal figures a long time. 2 things were happening in the crack at once. That was the only way to read it. On the wide western side, winter air poured down the way water finds the low place, and it pooled in the wet bottom and grew colder the deeper it went, exactly the trap the old miners warned of. But on the eastern side, something under the mountain was pushing a thin warm breath upward through a seam in the rock. Not a furnace, not a hot spring, nothing you could warm your hands at, only a few degrees of difference and a slow, steady rise. Between the falling cold and the rising warm, there was a band, a shelf of the crack about 15 feet down, where the air held near steady and out of the wind. Not warm, not safe. Steady. That was all. But steady was more than the whole camp above had to offer, where the temperature could fall 30 degrees between supper and midnight. She wanted to be careful about what she thought she knew. She had 4 readings and a smell and a guess about why. She had no proof the warm breath would keep breathing when the real cold came, and every reason to fear it would not. But she had one thing more, and it was the thing that turned the guess into a plan. She had her father. She remembered a day in the mine when she was maybe 10, standing where she should not have been, and Clement Dyer setting a temporary platform across a narrow winze so a man could work above the drop. He had wedged a heavy timber crossways between the 2 rock walls, and he had put her small hand flat against it, and he had said, "Feel that. That's a stool. You don't need a floor built up from the bottom when you've got 2 good walls close enough to reach across. The walls hold it. The tighter the fit, the harder the load pushes it home." He had driven a hardwood wedge and made her feel the timber pull tight instead of loose, and he had grinned at her face when she felt it happen. A narrow crack did not need a floor built up from the bottom. It needed a wall on each side close enough to bridge. The fissure at the 15-foot shelf was close enough to bridge. The idea came to her whole, the way the answer to a long sum sometimes does. She would not build a shack that the wind went through. She would not fight the cold on the surface where it was strongest. She would go down into the one place on the mountain where the air held still, to that steady shelf on the warm side of the crack, and she would hang a bed there, a platform bridged across the walls on stalls. The way her father set them, high above the cold water at the bottom, tucked against the eastern wall where the warm breath rose. She would wall the bunk itself in wool and canvas, so her own body's heat had somewhere to gather. She would leave the top of the crack open enough that snow could not seal it, and the air could keep moving. She would let the mountain do the one thing it was already doing, and she would only make a level place to lie down inside it. She said it out loud once, standing over the crack in the last light, to hear how mad it sounded. It sounded mad. Lyda Rourke told her so the next day, and Lyda was the closest thing to a friend she had left. Lyda was 26, a cook and laundress who had lost a husband to the same mountain and stayed anyway because there was nowhere cheaper to be poor. She had slipped Minta bread since Clement died, and she had lent the thermometers without asking too many questions, and when Minta finally told her the whole of it, the shelf, the stalls, the bed hung in the dark, Lyda made her show her. Lyda came to the fissure and looked at the black slot in the ground and the thin, scoured snow, and her face did a thing Minta had not seen it do before. Then she took hold of the rope ladder Minta had knotted and put her boots on the first rungs and went down. She got perhaps 6 feet before she stopped and looked up at the pale square of daylight and then down into the dark below her, and she climbed back out faster than she had gone in, and she stood in the snow breathing hard. "No," Lyda said. "Lyda, no. Listen to me, because I'll only fight you the once and then I'll help you or I won't." She counted it off on her fingers the way you list the reasons a stove will burn a house down. That stone is wet. Wet stone soaks your blankets in a night, and a wet blanket is worse than none. That's the first way it kills you. The rock's rotten in places. You told me yourself the walls flake, and a slab that lets go while you sleep is the second. A storm buries the mouth and you smother. That's the third. You take a lamp down to see by, and the bad air puts the lamp out, and then it puts you out, and you never wake to know it happened. That's the fourth. One rung of that ladder breaks, and you're hanging over the deep part with a broken leg, and nobody within a quarter mile. That's the fifth. And your warm breath there, she pointed at the crack. It's warm today, in November. What happens the night it goes cold on you? What happens when the mountain changes its mind in the middle of the worst storm of the year and you're 40 feet down with no fire and no way up? Minta did not answer quickly. She had learned that from her father, too. When a man tells you your timber is bad, you do not defend it. You look at it. "You might be right," she said at last, "about all of it. I don't know that the warm holds. I don't know the rock won't peel. I don't know a storm won't seal me in." She looked at Lyda. "So I won't sleep down there to find out. I'll build it and I'll leave it empty a week. 7 days, jars of water at every depth, cloth squares to weigh for damp, the thermometers reading morning and night. And I won't put my body in it until the crack has kept an empty bed alive through a hard week. If the water freezes on the shelf, I've lost some rope and some pride. If it doesn't," Lyda said, "you've still got every other way to die. Then I'll have fewer of them than I've got up here." Lyda looked at her a long moment. She did not say yes, but she did not take the thermometers back either, and that was its own kind of answer. There was one more thing Minta did not tell Lyda, because saying it would have made it real, and it was already real enough. She had counted her money against her plan, and the money would not stretch to cover it. She could buy more rope and a few iron spikes to make the descent something better than a knotted line over a 50-foot drop. Or she could buy another week of food. She could not do both. $1.85 did not build two things. She stood in the store doorway with the coins warm in her fist and made herself choose, and she chose the rope because hunger she could feel coming and fight a day at a time. but a broken line over the deep part would not give her a day. It would give her the time it took to fall. She bought the rope and 4 spikes and walked out with 40 cents and no more meals than she had woken with, and she did not let herself look at the barrels of flour on the way past. That was the first thing Merritt Sloan took from her. The second thing he tried to take was the timber. She had been pulling discards off the mine dump, cracked poles, short ends, pieces the company had marked as scrap and thrown down the waste slope to rot. She needed sound wood for the stalls and the deck, and scrap was the only wood a girl with 40 cents was going to get. She had dragged 3 spruce poles most of the way to the fissure when Sloan came up the slope behind her, with his coat buttoned to the throat and his ledger, always the ledger under his arm. Merritt Sloan was 41, the company's agent and creditor and part owner of the boarding house, a man who did his cruelty with a pen and a mild voice. He looked at the poles on the snow, and he did not raise that voice at all. "Company property," he said. "They're scrap. You threw them down the waste slope." "They were thrown down. They weren't given away. There's a difference, and the difference is mine." He set the ledger against his hip and opened it, unhurried, as though the two of them had all the daylight in the world. "You've been a great deal of trouble for a girl with no standing, Minta. Pulling timber, digging in that crack, half the camp watching you do it." He closed the book. "I'll make you an offer better than my last. Sign the settlement, and I'll put you by the boarding house boiler for the winter, warm, dry, fed. You'll live to see the spring, which is more than that hole in the ground will give you." "You didn't climb up here in the cold to keep me warm," Minta said. "Why do you care where I sleep?" Something moved behind Sloane's mild face, and it was gone before she could name it. "A death near the company workings brings an inquiry," he said. "Inquiries cost money and time. I'd rather not have a frozen girl found on my ground come thaw." It was true, and it was not the whole truth, and she could hear the hollow place where the rest of it should have been. She thought about the crack, and the warm breath, and the wet iron smell of stone that water had moved through. The same smell that made a man like Sloan open his ledger and start to calculate. But she was 16 and cold, and she did not yet have the shape of it, only the sense that he wanted the fissure to be his, and wanted her gone from it, and that the warm corner by the boiler was the price he was offering for both. "No," she said again. It was becoming the truest word she owned. Sloane's mouth thinned. He nodded once, as if she had settled something for him, and he bent and took hold of the longest and soundest of the 3 poles, the one she needed most, the one that would have made her center stall, and he dragged it back down the slope himself in his good coat rather than leave it for her. At the tree line he stopped and looked back. "Everything else you take from my dump," he said, "I'll call theft. And theft is a thing I can prove in front of a man with a badge, which is more than you can say for anything you believe about your father's wages." Then he was gone into the trees, and she was left with 2 poles instead of 3, and the taste of iron in the wind. If you have ever had someone stand over your work and tell you it was worthless, someone who didn't understand what you were building or didn't want to, tell us in the comments. Minta Dyer heard it from every side of that camp. Stay with her and watch what the doubters were about to learn. The camp learned the shape of her plan the way a camp learns everything, sideways and all at once. Men who would not speak to her found time to watch her. They stopped their wagons on the road above the prospect cut and sat with the reins slack to see the girl drag a 6-inch pole through the snow toward a hole in the ground. It was one of the older timbermen who put the thing into a single line, and the line went around the camp and stuck the way cruel, true-sounding things do, She was building furniture for her own grave. Someone, she never learned who, hung a small wooden coffin, no longer than a forearm, from the arm of the laundry sign, and it swung there in the wind for 2 days before Lita took it down. The children of the camp made a song of it, the way children do, and the song had 3 words in it, and the 3 words were Dyer's grave room, and they sang it after her when she passed with a coil of rope on her shoulder. She did not blame them exactly. That was the hard part. To a man who had spent his life near shafts and winzes, who had seen what bad ground did to good men, a girl choosing to sleep in an untested crack in the earth was not brave. It was reckless past the edge of sense. The mockery was cruel, but it was not stupid. It was the camp saying out loud the same fear that woke her at 2 in the morning in the powder shed, and she could not answer it with words. She could only answer it with a bed that did not become a grave. The store cut off her lamp oil next, unless she paid in advance, and she had 40 cents and could not spare it. So she learned to do without a flame below ground, which she would later understand had probably saved her life. Lita stopped helping her in the open because Sloane let it be known that a cook who assisted the Dyer girl might find her own place gone by January, and Lida had nowhere else to be poor. She still left bread on the tool chest when no one was looking, but she did it at night now and did not stay. And the mountain, which cared for none of it, sent down its first true snow. It came on a gray afternoon and did not stop for a day and a night, and when it broke, the upper trail to the good timber was closed, and the season had shut a door that would not open again until spring. Whatever Minta was going to build, she now had to build with what was already within reach of the fissure, in the cold, alone, before the next storm, and the one after that, found her still working. She started with the descent because Lida had been right about the rope. A knotted line over the deep part was a way to die, not a way to work. She drove her 4 spikes into a seam of solid rock a full body length back from the lip, where no snow load could shift them, and she rigged her new rope to them as a fixed line she could hold, coming and going. Then she began the ladder. Not a rope ladder now, but a stiff one, pegged and lashed from the soundest of her scrap, so a rung breaking under her would not drop her into the dark. She built it a section at a time on the surface where she could see her own work, and lowered each section and joined it below, hanging on the fixed line with her hands going numb in bursts she had to stop and warm against her own body. The cold made everything take 3 times as long. Wood that split clean at noon split wrong in the morning. Her fingers lost the fine work first. A peg she could have driven true in July went in crooked, and she pulled it and did it again, and again, because a crooked peg was a lie she would be standing on. Her knuckles cracked and bled, and she wrapped them in strips torn from her spare shift and kept on. She ate less than she needed and told herself the hunger was clarity. She measured everything twice with her father's knotted twine, and set nothing she had not tested with her own weight first, hanging on the fixed line, bouncing hard on each rung before she trusted it. By the end of that first week of true winter, she had the fixed line anchored and the pegged ladder down as far as the shelf, and she had proved to herself that she could get down and back up carrying nothing, on rock that had already dropped 1 slab past her shoulder into the dark while she worked. She had not set a single stall. She had not built 1 foot of the deck she would sleep on. The bed was still only charcoal figures on the inside of a chest lid. 6 weeks by her reckoning, until the hard cold came down for good, and most of the work not begun. She climbed out at dusk on the 7th day, her hands ruined and her legs shaking under her, and she coiled the surface end of her fixed line the way her father had taught her, 2 loops and a tuck, and left it anchored to the spikes for the morning. She ate the last of Lida's bread in the dark and slept in the powder shed, and she slept a little better for being tired past feeling the cold. In the morning, the rope was gone, not fallen, not frayed through and dropped down the crack. Gone. The loose end had been cut clean at the anchor with a blade, and the whole length of her new rope, the rope she had bought instead of food, the rope that was the only safe way down to everything she still had to build, had been carried off in the night. Around the spikes, the snow was churned and then smoothed again where fresh fall had come down on top, so that whatever tracks had been there were gone under an inch of white, and there was no way to say whose boots had made them. She stood over the cut end in the gray light with 40 cents in her pocket and no rope and 6 weeks of winter closing in, and for the first time since the door had latched behind her, she did not know what to do next. She was on her knees at the anchor spikes, splicing her father's worn manila to the cut stub of the stolen line, when the shadow fell across her hands. It was bad work, and she knew it. The old manila was 28 feet of tired fiber, too short to reach the shelf and too soft to trust, and twice she had told herself it would hold, and twice heard her father's voice. A rope you have to talk yourself into is already lying to you. Whoever taught you that splice, the shadow said, ought to be ashamed. The man was near 60, broad in the shoulder and bent a little to one side. 2 fingers on his right hand healed crooked, and an ankle he favored so plainly the pain showed in how he stood. He looked at the rope, then at the knots on her measuring twine coiled by her knee, too short and along over and over down its length. Something changed in his face when he saw the knots. Clement Dyer marked his line like that, the man said. Too short and along. Never met another man who did. He crouched with a grunt and ran the twine through his crooked fingers. You'd be his girl then, the one the camp's making songs about. He was my father, Minta said. Orrin Paddock. She had heard the name a timber boss once before the ankle. You knew him? I set stalls with him a whole winter at the Yankee Girl 20 years back. He lifted the ruined hand and let it drop. I've watched you 3 weeks, lowering thermometers into a crack that ought to grow ice, building a ladder better than half the men here would bother with. And now I find you about to hang yourself off a splice a drunk wouldn't trust. So which is it? Are you your father's daughter, or aren't you? Minta's jaw tightened. Somebody cut my line in the night. I bought that rope instead of food. I know what you bought. Paddock did not soften. I didn't ask what was done to you. I asked what you know. Which wall of that crack is sound and which is rotten? Where does the cold sit? What happens if your ladder breaks with you on it? And don't tell me it won't. What keeps the snow from sealing the mouth over you in your sleep? And when your timbers start to let go, because everything lets go, how will you know before it drops you? She answered him. She did not answer well, because she did not have all the answers, but she answered from the crack and not from hope. The eastern wall rang harder. The loose stone was on the west. The cold sat in the wet bottom below 30 feet. If her ladder broke, she died, which was why she wanted a second line she never let go of. She could keep the snow out only by covering part of the mouth, and how she would feel the timbers move she didn't know, and she said so plainly. Orrin was quiet a moment. No, he said at last. You don't know that one. Nobody's shown you. He stood, slow, working the bad ankle. I won't build your bed for you. I built plenty for men who couldn't be bothered to learn, and half are dead of things I'd have taught them in an afternoon. But I'll teach you, because you tested it before you believed it, and that's more than most grown men do. He picked up the ruined splice and dropped it in her lap. First lesson, burn that. We start with the rock. The first thing he taught her was how to listen to stone. He gave her the hammer back and had her strike the walls, low and clean, and told her to shut her eyes and hear only what came back. Good rock rain, a clear high note that carried ground she could trust. Bad rock gave back a dull, dead sound, drummy, he called it, like knocking on a box with something hollow behind. And where she heard that, the stone had already begun to part from the mountain, and it would come down when it chose, without telling her first. She struck the eastern wall at the shelf and heard the note ring, and she grinned before she could stop herself. "Don't smile yet," Orin said. He set her to sounding every foot of both walls, marking the dead note in charcoal, and twice he took the pry bar to stone that looked solid and peeled off a slab the length of her arm and made her count until it struck bottom. She counted to 3. 3 seconds of falling into water she could not see. That's the drop. That's why you never take your weight off the second line. And that, he pointed at the seam where the warm breath rose, 26 feet down, is the one place you'll want to build and the one place you can't. Altered rock. Water's been through it. It looks like stone and holds like clay. You build up here on the sound wall and let the warm come up to you. You don't chase it down. They rebuilt the descent from nothing because Orin would not have her single lining anything. It cost the last of her money and most of his, which he spent without comment. A pegged wooden ladder to the shelf, a separate safety line on its own, spikes, a body-length back that she clipped to and never released. A knotted emergency rope stored on the shelf itself for the day both others failed. 2 surface anchors set apart so no single crack in the lip could take them both. And a light hand line for tools so Minta would never again climb with a hammer in one hand and her life in the other. That was the rule Orin drove hardest, and it was the rule that failed first. They were setting the upper safety anchor when the stone around it shifted without warning. One moment the spike was fast, the next it drew, and Minta, her weight against the line to test it, as Orin had taught her, dropped. She fell 4 feet before the ladder caught her hip against the rock. The pain went through her like a struck bell. She hung there with her torn palm shrieking and a bruise already blooming that she would carry a month, and above her, Orin shouted her name in a voice she had not heard him use. He got her up, sat her against the tool chest, and looked at the drawn anchor a long time. 2 days, he said. There's no time. The cold. The rock told me that Spike was good, and the rock lied. The mountain doesn't hurry, so you can't. You go slow enough to catch the lie, or fast enough to catch the fall. There's no third way. He stood. 2 days, we reset it right and test it with iron, and not before. She hated the 2 days, cold and hungry with the countdown running in her head. 5 weeks now, maybe less. But sitting furious and still, she learned that patience is a thing you spend, not a thing you have. Then they set the stalls, and everything she had believed became real in wood. The crack at the shelf ran from 4 feet 8 inches wide to 5 feet 3, and Orin picked 3 spruce poles a full 6 inches through and taught her to cut each one longer than the gap it bridged, on purpose. She trimmed the low end to a natural shoulder in the sound rock and seated the high end against a headboard laid flat to spread the bite. Then the wedges. Hardwood, driven in pairs from opposite sides, tapped and tapped again, each stroke pulling the timber tighter until the whole stall sang under the hammer the way the good rock had. And she understood at last what her father had meant with her small hand on the timber over the wines. The tighter the fit, the harder the load pushed it home. A stall did not hold in spite of the weight on it. It held because of it. Orin made her offset the 3, no 2 in the same course of rock, so that if one wall fracture let go, it could not take all 3 at once, and add cross bracing rather than trust the wedges alone. Across the stalls she laid a deck of 2-inch lagging planks, 5 feet by 6. A floor hung in the dark 15 feet down where the air held steady, 3 seconds of falling underneath it. She wanted to sleep on it that night. Without meaning to, she had begun to think of it as done. Orin loaded it with scrap iron instead. He stacked iron and filled ore sacks with waste rock until the deck carried more than Minta and her bedding and food, and a grown man besides, marked every stull where it met the rock with a line of charcoal, and left the load hanging overnight. In the morning, Minta went down first and found what she did not want to find. 2 marks sat where they had been. The third had crept, not even a quarter inch. But it had moved, and a thing that moves a quarter inch in a night moves more in 10. She would have shimmed it. She said so. A wedge, a shim, tighten it, and go on. They had no time. Orin made her tear it out. The whole corner, stull, headboard, wedges, dismantled and reset from the sound rock up. 2 more days gone because a shim on a stull that had already moved was a prayer, not a repair. It was harder than the fall. And when the new charcoal line held through a second-loaded night, he said the only thing that ever sounded like praise from him. Now it's a floor, he said. Before, it was a wish. There was more, and Orin taught each piece the same way, by making her do it and rejecting it until it was right. A dripboard angled over the bunk so the wall seep ran past the bedding, not into it, because warmth, he said again and again, was worthless the moment the wool went wet. A wet blanket at 40 degrees killed as surely as a dry one at 10 below, only slower. A gutter chipped into a ledge to carry the water off. Oilcloth under the tick, slats she could lift and dry, and over it all a hood of wool and canvas closing in only the space where her body lay, so the little heat she made could gather, instead of bleeding into the whole cold length of the crack. He taught her the air last, and most carefully. He lit a wick and let it smoke at the mouth of the bunk, and made her watch how it moved, drawn down the cold western wall, curling along the deck, rising again on the warm eastern side toward the daylight far above. There was a current in the crack, slow but real, and her bed sat in the path of it. His rules kept that path open. No charcoal, ever. No stove. No lamp burning while she slept. Never seal the canvas all the way. A gap the width of her fist low, a wider one above. And if she ever woke with a headache, a thickness in her thoughts, hard breathing for no reason, or saw a flame go weak and yellow, she was to go up, not finish the thought, go up. Bad air doesn't hurt, he told her. That's what makes it bad. It just puts you to sleep, and you thank it for the rest. The countdown ran on beside the work, kept in charcoal on the chest lid. 6 weeks out, the ladder and anchors done. 4 weeks, 2 stalls standing. 3 weeks, the failed stall reset and holding. 2 weeks, the deck and drainage finished. 10 days, the hood sewn and hung. And through all of it, the mountain kept its own count, in shorter days and harder frosts, and a sky gone the flat white of coming snow. Help came in ways that did not announce themselves. Lita left more than bread now. An old feather tick, worn but dry. 2 heavy wool skirts too far gone to wear and perfect to line a bunk. Dried beans, a lidded chamber pot so Minta needn't climb into a storm in the dark. She never called it a gift. She'd have called it clutter she was glad to be rid of, and Minta let her, because they both knew what it was, and neither could afford to say so. And Byram Keene, of all people, brought back the timber, the long spruce pole Sloane had taken, the one that would make her center stall. He dropped it in the snow and stood with his hands in his coat. I checked the tally. Sloane wrote these off his waste 18 months ago, signed it himself, so they're not company property whatever he told you, and I'll say as much to any man with a badge. He nodded at the crack. Doesn't mean I think you'll live in it, but a man who lies on a tally lies on other things, and I've had my fill of Merritt Sloane's arithmetic. He did not stay to be thanked. Minta was learning that the people of this camp gave sideways or not at all, and that the ones who mattered most pretended they'd given nothing. Sloane came too, with 2 laborers and a claim, on the day the surface cover went up, and told his men to pull it down. Orrin met him at the lip with the discarded material tally open, and Sloane's own signature at the bottom of it, and the 2 laborers looked at the page, then at each other, and did not move. "The timber's written off," Orrin said. "Argue it with your own hand." Sloane's mild voice did not change. "The ground it sits on is company ground." "Is it?" Minta stepped up beside Orrin, her aching hip hidden. "This crack doesn't touch a single working of yours. You'd have to run a survey to prove it does. And a survey costs money and puts a county man on this mountain looking at your books, so run it, or leave my roof alone." For a moment, something in Sloane's face went very still, and Minta understood she'd guessed right about the survey he did not want, and the account book he wanted no county man reading. Then the mildness came back down like snow over a track. "Winter will settle this for me," he said, and turned his men around and took them down the slope and left the cover standing. The first night she slept below, Orrin stayed at the surface the whole night through, sitting by the anchors in his coat with a lantern he was under strict orders not to lower. The camp thermometer read below 0 before midnight. On the shelf, out of the wind, the air held in the middle 40s, and inside the wool hood, her own body warmed it a few degrees more. It was not comfortable. Her nose stayed cold, her hands ached, and she woke a dozen times to the close dark and the far drip into the sump. But she did not shiver, and in the morning the water in the tin cup had not frozen. Above her, in a camp where men slept 10 feet from roaring stoves, more than one water bucket had a skin of ice on it by dawn. She climbed up shaking and grinning and found Orrin gray-faced from a night in the cold and started to tell him it had held. He raised his crooked hand to stop her. He had already gone down. He had already seen the things she had missed in her joy. One of the headboards had a crack running through it. Resonance. She stood in the white morning with the cold cup still in her hand and looked at the split wood, and the triumph went out of her all at once, like heat out of a wall. She had slept warm in a crack in the earth that the whole camp said was a grave, and the grave had spent the night quietly trying to prove them right. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Orrin went back down to read the wood. The wall had not moved. Orrin was certain within the hour. The sound rock held. The charcoal marks held. The anchors had not drawn. The headboard had split for a plainer reason. Cut from a checked pole with a hidden season crack in the grain, it had dried in the cold until the crack opened. Not the mountain moving. A bad board doing what bad boards do. They replaced it with a thicker piece and added a retaining brace behind it, so the headboard's load would carry even if the new board someday failed too. And by the last week of January, in the year 1899, the platform was finished. Minta kept its record the way her father would have. On ordinary nights, the camp thermometer fell below 0 again and again, while the shelf held in the low to middle 40s, steady as a held breath. The bottom hovered at freezing and grew ice on the wet western wall. The warm seam at 26 feet breathed its few degrees upward. No furnace, only a slow, faithful current. And inside the hood, in dry wool, out of the wind, a girl could sleep. These were her measurements, and she trusted them because she had tested every one. She did not let herself trust them too far. Keene came to inspect it because he could not help himself. He sounded the walls and looked at the stalls and the drainage and the vent, and what he said was the closest he had come to being wrong out loud. "It's built," he admitted. "Better built than the bunkhouse I sleep in." Then the old flat weight came back. "But you've proved the easy half, that it holds you on a cold night. You haven't proved it in a wind that drives snow sideways or through a week of it, and you haven't proved the one thing that matters most. He looked at the narrow mouth of the crack. You've proved it can hold you. You haven't proved it will let you out. The words sat in Minta long after he had gone. Lita saw a different thing. She saw that Minta's wrists had gone thin, that a girl who had cut her food to buy rope and spikes was burning herself for fuel. The crack keeps you from freezing, Lida said, holding out a heel of bread until Minta took it. It doesn't put anything back in you. The cold still takes you in a hollow like that. It just takes its time. She made Minta eat it in front of her. It was the first thing she had eaten that day. Then the mountain sent its warning, and the warning came in signs before it came in snow. The telegraph office had word of a great cold pushing down out of the north, colder than anything yet. Orin read the barometer at the mine dry and did not like the fall of it. The mules would not settle, and on the high slopes above the bunkhouses, snow had been building load on load through the still weeks, waiting for something to shake it loose. Orin meant to stay by the fissure through it, but on the afternoon the sky went the color of a bruise. Word came that a man had been crushed under a fall of muck at a lower mine and needed carrying to Ironton before the grade closed, and there were not enough soundbacks to do it. Orin looked at his bad ankle, at the darkening sky, at Minta, and she saw the war in him. Go, she said. He'll die on the mountain if you don't. You'll not sleep in that crack tonight. It was not a question. You'll take the washroom by the boiler. One night. The weather this is going to be is not the weather to be alone underground for the first time. I built it for this weather, Minta said. This is the night it's for. If I run from it now, I never built anything but a hole. She met his eyes. Go carry your man. I'll see you when it breaks. Orin looked at her a long moment, and whatever he saw, he did not argue. He gripped her shoulder once with his ruined hand, hard, and went down the slope into the failing light to carry a stranger off the mountain. Minta turned to her fissure alone, the first flakes already coming down sideways on the wind. She was checking her vent slot for the 10th time when the wind shifted, and the snow that had been falling past the mouth of the crack began, instead, to fall into it. The storm came down on the Red Mountain camp that night, like something with a purpose. It was not the deadliest winter the mountains had known, though the men who lived through it would reach for large words afterward. It was one of the hardest spells of cold and avalanche those camps had yet seen, part of a great outbreak that pushed record cold down the length of the country, and up high it did its worst work in wind. The camp thermometer dropped toward 24 degrees below zero, and the wind made that number a lie in the direction of worse. The upper road simply ceased to exist. Minta went down before the main blast arrived, the way Orin had drilled her, and she pulled the timber and canvas cover across most of the mouth, and left the ventilation slot open the width of 2 hands, exactly as the smoke had told them it must be. Within an hour, the snow had narrowed the slot to the width of 1. She climbed to clear it. She went up the ladder clipped to the safety line, and she reached the mouth and dug the packed snow out of the slot with her hands, and she went back down, and 2 hours later she climbed and did it again. The third time the wind had risen to where it plucked at her on the ladder, and she had to set her boots wide and hold with both hands between digs, and she understood that a 4th trip in this wind might be a trip she did not come back from. The lip of the crack in a storm like this was no place for a body that could be blown off it. So she went to the second vent, the one Orin had made her build, and she had grumbled at building, a passage lined with thin plank, no wider than 4 inches, running up on a diagonal through broken rock beside the main mouth, out of the wind's direct reach. When she uncovered its lower end, the passage was singing, a thin, high whistle of air moving through it, and the whistle was the sweetest sound she had heard all night, because a whistling vent was a living vent, and a living vent meant she could breathe. She was listening to it whistle, telling herself she had won the first round when she heard the other sound. Voices above the wind, human voices near the mouth of the crack, shouting a word she could not make out, and then a word she could. Her name. Lyda had come up the mountain in the storm, and she had not come alone. The company bunkhouse stove had failed. A downdraft in the wind had filled the room with smoke, and the men, choosing smoke death slow over fire death fast, had put the stove out entirely, and the temperature in the room had begun to drop toward the temperature outside. Lita had been in the boarding house kitchen when the word came, and she had grabbed the one person nearest her and struck out for the assay office, which had a good stove and a chimney that faced away from the wind. But the one person nearest her had been Matty Crow, the kitchen boy, 12 years old, and Matty had gone down on the ice 50 yards short of the assay office and turned his ankle so he could not walk on it, and in the dark and the driving snow Lyda had not been able to carry him the rest of the way. She had knelt over him with the cold coming into both of them and thought, of all the places on that mountain, of the one warm place she had said was a grave. They arrived at the mouth of the fissure with the boy half carried, and the entrance already filling with the snow. Minta had been fighting all night. There was no time to talk it through. Minta rigged the tool line, the light hand line built to lower hammer, now asked to lower a child, Giprom, and she made a loop, and she talked Matty into the loop over his own crying in Lyda's, and she took his weight on the line hand over hand and lowered him down the 15 feet to the shelf. And then she brought Lyda down the ladder behind him, clipped to the safety line, one rung at a time in the dark. Then there were 3 of them on a deck built for one, and the stalls, which had held iron all night without a sound, creaked. Minta heard it, and her stomach dropped, and then she heard it again, and she made herself do the thing Oren had trained into her instead of the thing fear wanted. She checked the charcoal marks by feel in the dark. They held. The creak was the deck taking a load it had never carried before. 3 living bodies where it had been proved on dead iron, but the marks held, and the stalls were only speaking, not slipping. She told the other 2 so, out loud, in a voice she made steady on purpose, because a steady voice was a thing she could give them when she had nothing else. Lita was wet. That was the next danger and the worst, and Minta smelled it before the dark let her see it. The sodden wool of a skirt and stockings that had knelt in snow, and Minta knew from every one of Oren's lessons that wet wool at 40 degrees was a slow executioner. She made Lyda strip off the outer skirt and the soaked stockings there in the cramped dark over Lyda's protests, and she wrapped her in the dry reserve wool from the storage box and pulled the feather tick around all 3 of them. The rock isn't what keeps you warm, Minta said, working in the dark, and she was not sure whether she was telling Lyda or telling herself. It never was. It's staying dry. It's the wool. It's the 3 of us close and the wind that can't reach us. She got Matty's boot off his swelling ankle and pulled the boy against her under the tick. The crack just stops the cold from taking it away faster than we can make it. That's all it ever did. Matty had begun to shiver, great racking waves of it, and Minta reached into the bedding for the stoppered bottle she had kept warm against her own body all night, and gave him water off it, warm, not hot, sipped slow, and a ration of sugar on his tongue, and she held him and made him talk to her so she would know he was still there in his head. If you're down in the dark with these 3, hold on, because the crack is about to do the one thing Minta swore it never would. If this story has its hands on you, subscribe now and stay with us. What happens in the next few minutes is what the whole winter was building toward, because the warm breath began to fail. She felt it before the thermometer confirmed it. The storm outside was doing something to the pressure of the whole mountain, and the slow, faithful current that had breathed up the eastern wall all winter thinned and stuttered, and the mercury on the shelf that had held so steady in the middle 40s slid down 44, 42 toward 41. It was still warmer than the killing cold above by more than 60 degrees. It was still survival, but it was falling, and it was not supposed to fall, and every certainty Minta had built the winter on was suddenly a thing she had assumed and not a thing she knew. The ice on the western wall crept upward. The cold in the sump reached higher than she had ever measured it. And then the mountain moved. Somewhere above and to the north, a slope that had been loading snow all through the still weeks let go, or a great cornice of it dropped, or the wind simply drove a whole hillside of powder down at once. She never knew exactly what, only that the ground itself shuddered, and a rain of loosened fragments came down the crack out of the dark. One struck the deck a foot from her hand, another cracked against a cross brace with a sound she felt in her teeth, and the brace shifted, and one corner of the deck dropped a hand's width and hung there. She did not think. She clipped herself to the safety line, put Maddie into Lyda's arms, and went under the platform into the 3-second dark, hanging over the sump to reach the spare brace Oren had made her store below for exactly this, and swore she would never need. Her torn palm split open again as she worked, and the blood made the hammer handle slick, and she wedged the replacement brace home by feel with her hand, leaving red on everything she touched, driving it, and testing it, and driving it again until the dropped corner came back up and held. When she climbed back onto the deck, she was shaking, and it was not from the cold. She had barely got the tick back around the 3 of them when the whistle stopped. The second vent had gone silent. The storm had finally packed snow into the one passage she had trusted to breathe for her, and now there was no current on the shelf at all, only 3 people and their own slow souring air in a sealed crack in the earth, and the first faint thickness beginning at the edges of Minta's thoughts that Oren had warned her never to wait on. Lyda's hand found her arm in the dark. "Light the lamp," Lyda said. "Just for a minute, so we can see if—" "No." Minta's voice came out harder than she meant. She had a lamp on the shelf, and she had oil, and every part of her wanted the light, wanted to see the faces beside her and the wood around her, and to stop being blind. And every one of Oren's lessons stood against it. A flame in going bad air ate the same air they were breathing, and it would tell her the air was bad only by killing all 3 of them a little faster while they watched it die. The flame breathes what we breathe. We don't burn it. Not now. She sat in the total dark with a bleeding hand and a wet friend and a shivering boy, and she understood with terrible clearness that there was no waiting her way out of this. Waiting meant the air went slowly to nothing, while they grew stupid and warm and grateful. And the only other way out was up the packed ladder, out the sealed mouth, into a wind that had already nearly blown her off the lip once tonight, toward an opening that might be under 3 feet of drift. She had built a shelter to keep her out of that storm. Now the shelter itself was going to send her back into it. Minta took the knotted emergency rope off its peg, and she clipped to the safety line, and she started up into the dark. The main ladder's upper rungs were packed solid with driven snow, unclimbable, so she went by the interior handline and the ladder together, hauling and kicking, with a short shovel she had stored on the shelf for exactly this shoved through her belt. And when she reached the top and found the mouth plugged white and solid above her, she did not drive the shovel straight up into the center of it, because Oren's voice in her head told her that a plug dug from below at its center comes down all at once and comes down on the digger. Instead, she worked to the side, toward the lee corner beneath the standing cover, where the snow would be softest and least loaded, and she dug there, one-handed, braced on the ladder, the wind finding her the moment she opened the first inch. She dug, and the snow filled in behind her hand, She dug, and her arm went dead, and she changed arms and dug with the torn one until the blood froze on it. Twice the little she had opened slumped shut, and she started again, cursing in her father's words. And below her in the dark, Lida called up asking was she all right, and she saved her breath and did not answer. And then the shovel broke through into air, and a finger width of it, and the wind screamed in the little hole she had made, and on the shelf far below the canvas of the hood shifted and settled as the pressure of the whole crack equalized with a long sigh, and the sour thickness at the edge of Minta's thoughts began slowly to clear. She widened the hole until it whistled the way the vent had whistled, and then she went back down to the two she had left in the dark. Above them, the camp was losing its fight. A cabin roof on the lower row went in under the snow load, with a crack the whole camp heard. The company bunkhouse, its stove dead, held men who wrapped themselves in everything they owned and still could not stop shaking. One miner who tried to cross the 20 feet to the assay office lost the line of it in the whiteout and was found near morning against a fence he had passed 3 times, barely knowing his own name. Lower on the grade, Orrin and Keene and the men carrying the crushed miner gave up on Ironton and forded up in a mine dry, and Orrin sat in the cold and did not sleep, thinking about a crack in the earth and a girl he had left alone in it. And in the crack, through the coldest black hours of that night, the thing Minta had built did what she had built it to do. The surface stayed murderous. The shelf, its warm breath thinned but not gone, its vent reopened by a bleeding hand, steadied and held between 41 and 43 degrees. The water Minta had set against the western wall grew a skin of ice by the deepest part of the night. The water in the stoppered bottle inside the hood, warmed by their 3 bodies, stayed liquid to the last drop. The stalls, offset and cross-braced and reset once when a quarter-inch scared her, held 3 living people through an avalanche's shudder and kept their charcoal marks. And the reopened vent breathed thin and steady, a current on Minta's face in the dark that she had come to love more than warmth. They were cold. All 3 of them were cold all night, cold to the bone, cold in a way none of them would quite forget. But they were coherent, and they were dry where it mattered, and none of them slid down into the warm, grateful sleep that does not end. Minta kept them talking. She kept Maddie's ankle raised and his mouth moving. She kept her fingers on Lida's wrist through the worst of it, counting. At the first gray of dawn, when the wind finally began to fall, 2 men found the mouth of the fissure by the one thing that showed above the drift, the pale vent marker Minta had set to stand above the deepest snow she could imagine, and had been mocked for. Keene reached it first, and Orrin was a step behind him on his ruined ankle, and they dug down to the whistling hole and cleared it, and Orrin put his face to the opening and called her name down into the dark, and out of the crack in the earth that the whole camp had called a grave, cold and bleeding and hollow-cheeked, with a boy and a woman alive beside her, Minta Dyer called back. She had not survived in comfort. She came up with a hand that would scar, a food cache all but gone, a brace she had reset in the dark over a 50-foot drop, and a body burned so thin the winter had nearly taken her the slow way, even as the fissure kept it from taking her the fast one. But she came up. All 3 of them came up into a gray morning over a camp that had lost a roof and nearly lost a man, and stood in the falling wind alive. Merritt Sloan was among the men who had gathered at the mouth by then, drawn by the shouting. He looked at the 3 faces coming up out of the crack he had told her would kill her. He did not say he was glad. He did not say he was sorry. He looked at the warm breath still rising faintly from the mouth into the cold morning air, the mineral smell of it, and Minta watched his eyes change and watched him do the arithmetic she had feared he would do from the very first day. That crack, Sloane said, loud enough for the gathered men to hear, is on company mineral ground, and I'll have a survey up here to prove it. Merritt Sloane said the crack sat on company mineral ground, and for the length of one breath, the only sound on that ruined slope was the wind combing the drifts. Then Byram Keene stepped between Sloane and the mouth of the fissure. He had a boy wrapped in his own coat and a cook leaning on his arm, and he had spent the whole night digging toward a girl he had called a fool since November, and something in him had changed in the digging. "You want to file on it, Sloane. You file," Keene said, and his voice was flat and carrying, the voice a shift foreman uses to end an argument. "But you'll do it in front of every man on this mountain who watched 3 people come up out of that hole alive when the ones in your bunkhouse near froze around a cold stove. You go to the county with that. See how it reads." He shifted the boy's weight. "I'll be a witness. I just won't be yours." Sloane looked at the faces along the slope. Men who had been laughing at coffin jokes a month before and were not laughing now. And he closed his ledger. He did not withdraw the claim. Men like Merritt Sloane do not withdraw. They wait for a better light. But he went down the mountain that morning with nothing, and behind him the camp gathered at the mouth of the crack. It had named a grave and looked down into it as though seeing it for the first time. Men who had carved a coffin into the paint of a laundry sign in December stood at the lip in February with their hats in their hands and no jokes left in them. One of them, an older miner who had been among the loudest, looked a long time down the dark throat of the fissure where the warm breath still rose thin against the killing cold, and said to no one in particular that he had lived on that mountain 20 years and never once thought to ask what the ground was trying to tell him. That was the whole of the apology the camp ever made, and it was enough, because it was true. The 3 who had come up out of it recovered slowly. Matty Crow's ankle mended crooked and gave him a limp he would carry to a good old age, and he told the story of that night for the rest of his life, and told it true, which was rare. Lida Rourke lost the tips of 2 fingers to the cold, and never once said she regretted the climb. And Minta slept 11 hours the first night in Lida's back room, and woke to find the camp had left things on the doorstep: bread, a sack of coffee, a good wool blanket, a pair of boots near her size. No notes. The people of that place still gave sideways, but they gave. She had gone down that crack alone in November with 40 cents and a dead man's rope, and the camp had built her a coffin out of jokes. She came up in February with 2 lives beside her own, and the same hands that had painted the joke began, one by one, to knock on Lida's door and ask, not quite meeting her eyes, how a person might do what she had done. Lida Rourke changed first, and changed most, because she had been the loudest doubter and had the best reason to stop. It was Lida who had stood at the mouth of the crack in November and counted off on her fingers the 5 ways a hole in the ground would kill a girl: bad air, wet, a fall of rock, a buried way out, a slow freeze. It was Lida who had climbed down into that hole in February with a hurt boy on her arm, because it was the one place on the mountain she knew for certain the wind could not reach. She had come up alive with 2 fingertips gone to the cold, and she did not talk about the 5 ways anymore. What she said now, to anyone in her kitchen who would listen, was shorter. "I watched it work. I was in it. Say what you want about the girl. I'm above ground because she counted better than the mountain did." That was the change, and it did not come as thanks. It came as questions. A timberman from the lower works came first, turning his hat in his hands, asking about the sounding of walls, how you told good rock from bad by the ring of it. Then a married man with 3 children and a cabin that had lost its roof in the storm, wanting to know whether every crack in the mountain breathed warm or only some. Then two brothers who worked a lease up the gulch and had watched their own shelter fail them and wanted to know why hers had not. Minta answered them the way Orin had answered her, not with comfort, with questions back. Which wall is sound and how do you know? Where does your cold sit? What happens when your way out is buried? She turned no one away and she made nothing sound easy, because Orin had taught her that a lie told kindly still kills the man who believes it, and she would not send a soul down a crack believing warmth alone would save him. Warmth was the smallest part of it. The work was the rest. If you have ever built something the people around you were sure would fail, and kept building it anyway, alone, while they laughed, then Minta Dyer's story is already partly yours, and I would ask you to do one small thing. Share this with the one person in your life who needs to hear that the doubters are not always right. It costs you nothing, and it is how these stories find the people who need them. She began, without deciding to become a teacher. She walked with the married man up his gulch and sounded his crack for him and told him plainly it would not do. The eastern face rang dead as a drum, rotten 10 feet down, and no deck she could build would hang safe on it. She found him a better fissure a quarter-mile on, narrower and colder at the mouth but sound to the touch, and she drew him a plan of it in charcoal on a plank, where the stalls went, how the drainage ran, where the air had to move. She would not build it for him. She made him build it, and come get her, and she went down and sounded every joint before she would let his children near it. When it held its first hard night, she felt something she had not expected, a thing steadier than pride. She had not saved one crack from the cold. She had begun to hand the cold a whole mountain of people it could no longer reach. Not every crack could be saved, and she learned to say so without flinching. A widower with 2 small daughters begged her to make his cabin cellar into a winter refuge, and she went down into it and sounded it and told him no. The rock was rotten, the air was dead, there was no second way out, and she would not put his girls in it for any money or any pity he could offer. He was angry with her for a week. Then she found him a sound crack on the sunward side of his own claim and drew him the plan of it, and by the time the first snow flew, he understood that the no had been the kindest thing she gave him. A teacher who says yes to everything, Orin had told her once, is a teacher who has never had to bury a student. By the end of that first summer, there were shelters up and down the gulch that Minta Dyer had sounded or planned or refused, and the pattern of them had begun to look like a system. She marked each sound refuge the way she had marked her own, a pale strip of cloth on a protruding pole, so that a person running blind in a whiteout could still find the mouth. She showed the families how to lay in a dry cache below the deck and above the damp, matches in a stoppered bottle, hard bread, a wool blanket, a spare rope knotted and ready. She was not building beds anymore. She was building a map of the mountain the cold could not erase, a scatter of warm, sound places a person could run to when the wire said run, each one marked, each one checked, each one hers in the way that mattered, even where the ground beneath them belonged, on paper, to other men. Through all of it, Orrin Paddock grew older in front of her. The night of the crisis had cost him. He had carried a crushed man down an icing grade on an ankle that had no business under a load, and then he had been caught by the blow and had waited it out in a freezing mine dry. And then, at dawn, he had knelt on the frozen lip of her fissure and dug with his ruined hands until his girl answered him from below. An old man does not spend a night like that for free. The cough came in March and did not leave. It settled into his chest and made a wet sound when he breathed, and he grew thin, and the crooked fingers that had taught her to drive a wedge true began to tremble when he thought no one watched. He would not stop coming up the slope. He sat at the lip on the good days, wrapped in a blanket against a spring that could not quite warm him, and watched her teach and corrected her when she softened a lesson. Once, when she told a nervous man his crack would probably hold, Oren's voice came dry and hard from the rock behind her. Probably, there's a word to bury a family by. It holds or it doesn't, and if you don't know which, you say so. The man went pale, and Minta learned again that kindness and honesty were not always the same coat, and that Oren had been trying to teach her the difference since the day he found her at the splice. On the bad days, he stayed below, and she went to him, and he talked, because a man who feels the time shortening begins to spend his knowledge like a miser, finally opening the box. He gave her back her father in pieces, and each piece made Clement Dyer a little more whole. He told her about the winter at the Yankee Girl, the two of them setting sculls in a stope so wet the water ran down their collars, and the way Clement had of laying a flat hand on a timber and going still, feeling for a tremor no ear could catch. He told her about the day the fourth level began to work, a sound, he said, like a door easing open somewhere far off in the dark, and how her father had gotten 11 men out ahead of a fall that filled the drift floor to roof, counting heads at the ladder, going back twice, the last man over his shoulder. He should have died in there, Oren said. He walked out counting. That's who you come from. Not from the man a roof finally caught this September. From the one who walked 11 men out ahead of one. Minta held that story the way she held few things. Her father had died under a roof at the last, the way timbermen often did, and the camp remembered him for the death, because deaths are what camps remember. Oren gave her back the other man, the one who counted heads in the dark, and it was the truest gift she was given in that whole hard year, worth more than any bread left on a doorstep. He gave her the tools, too, and made nothing of it. One afternoon he set the good hammer and the sounding bar in her hands, the bar worn bright at the striking end from 30 years of ringing stone, and closed her fingers over them with his two crooked ones. "You'll drive a truer wedge than I can now," he said. "Might as well be your steel." That was the whole of the ceremony. He would have been embarrassed by more. The cough won in the last week of April. He died in a room in Lida's boarding house, a room she had given over without being asked, with the window open to the spring he had wanted badly to see one more time. Minta sat with him through the last of it. Lida came and went with broth he could no longer take. Outside the aspens were breaking bud, and the gulch was loud with meltwater. He was not afraid, or he had the old timberman's decency not to show it. His mind wandered near the end, back to stopes and stalls and men long dead, and once he called her by her father's name, and she let him, and answered as Clement would have, because it cost her nothing and gave him ease. Then he came back to himself and looked at her clearly and asked the one question that seemed to matter. "The center stall," he said. "The charcoal. It still lines up?" "Every mark," she told him. "Not moved a hair since the storm." He nodded, slow, as though she had closed an account he had carried a long time. A little while after that, his breathing changed, and then it stopped, and the room was very quiet except for the water running outside the open window. Resonance. She kept his sounding bar the rest of her life, and to the end of it, the striking end stayed bright, because she used it every day and would not let it go to rust. A man who had spent his years teaching timber to hold up mountains was taken, in the end, by one cold night given to a stranger, and the last thing on his mind was not whether he had lived well, but whether her work still held. It held. It would go on holding after both of them, in cracks up and down that gulch, because he had spent his final winter making certain of it. She buried him beside the road to Ironton, in ground just thawed enough to take him, and she cut his name into a plank with the same care he had taught her to cut a joint. Then she went back to work, because that was the only grief he would have called honest. The mountain gave her no time to sit with it. Spring came down off the high country the way it always did there, all at once and dangerous, and the same warmth that had killed Oren's winter began to kill the snowpack, and the snowpack came off the peaks as water. The fissure that had kept the cold out could not keep the water off. Minta felt the change before she saw it. The steady drip into the sump grew to a trickle and then to a voice, and the wet western wall darkened and ran. And when she went down to the shelf one morning in early May, the air on the platform had gone raw and heavy in a way the cold had never made it. The warm seam still breathed, but its breath came wrong now, thick with damp, and far below in the dark she could hear the sump filling, not with the slow patience of winter melt, but with the surge of a whole slope letting go at once. For 3 days she went down each morning to read it, the way Oren had taught her to read everything, by measurement and not by hope. She marked the water's rise with charcoal on the western wall, and watched the marks drown one after another, faster, each day. She laid her flat palm against the wet rock the way her father used to, and where the wall had rung hard and clean all through the winter, it gave back now, under her hand, the faintest working tremor, the sound of frost coming out of stone that had held it locked for months. Water was getting behind the face, and water behind a rock face is a wedge the mountain drives for itself, patient and enormous, and no charcoal mark and no sound stall ever set could hold a wall the mountain had made up its mind to take. On the third morning the tremor had grown, and while she stood there, a chip of rock the size of her fist let go from the western face and fell past her shoulder into the dark and struck the risen water with a sound like a stone dropped down a well. She climbed out and sat at the lip a long time, Oren's bar across her knees, and she understood the hardest thing either of the men who taught her had ever tried to teach, the thing that lay beneath all the sounding and the wedging and the reading of air. She understood that she had to leave it. The platform was sound, the stalls held, the charcoal marks were true, but the western wall was taking on water by the hour, and saturated rock is heavier rock, and heavier rock pulls harder on whatever holds it, and a face that rang solid in a dry December can slab off wet in a running May and take the deck and everything on it down into a rising sump in the dark. No shelter was worth dying in. Oren had never once told her that a good shelter was one you never left. He had told her the opposite. Twice. That the master of a thing is the one who knows its edges, and that the timberman who cannot bring himself to walk away from his own good work is the one they carry out. So Minta Dyer, who had refused a warm washroom in the teeth of the worst storm those mountains had seen because the crack was the very thing it was built for, climbed up out of that same crack in the wet of spring and did not go back down. She took a dry corner of Lida's boarding house instead and let the water have the fissure until the melt was spent. It was not surrender. It was the last lesson learned in her own hands. There is a kind of courage in staying, and a rarer, harder kind in knowing the exact hour to go. Not everyone had learned it. Del Corbin was a young miner, not yet 22, quick and eager, and sure he was clever, and he had watched Minta's crack keep the cold out all winter and had done the arithmetic that clever young men do. Rent at the boarding house ate his wages. A crack in the ground was free. He had found himself a fissure a half-mile up the gulch, and rather than come to Minta and stand for her questions, he had thrown a deck across it in a weekend. No sounding of the walls, no drainage cut, no load test, no charcoal to warn him of a slip. He had seen the shape of what she did, and copied the shape, and thought the shape was the whole of it. She had heard about it, and walked up there and told him, plain as Orrin would have, that his eastern wall rang dead as a coffin lid, and would not hold through a thaw. He had laughed at her. Everyone had laughed at her once. He did not see why his turn should be different. In the third week of the melt, with the whole slope running water, and every wet fracture in the gulch groaning as the frost came out of it, Del Corbin went down to sleep in his free crack. The wall let go a little after midnight. It came off in a slab the size of a barn door. The exact failure Minta had told him it would be, sheared clean where the rotten rock had parted from the sound, and it took out one side of his deck and pinned his leg against the far wall and left him wedged in the dark, with the water rising below him and no second line, because he had not thought he needed one, and no emergency rope, because he had not known to store one, and no one on earth knowing where he was. Except that Minta Dyer knew exactly where he was, because she had stood in that crack a week before and read its death in the ring of its wall. Word came down to Lida's a little after 1 in the morning. A boy sent running by the miners in the next tent, who had heard a man screaming up the gulch and would not go near a wet crack in the dark themselves. Minta was up and dressed before the boy had finished. She took Orrin's sounding bar and a full coil of good rope and the short shovel, and she went first to the bunkhouse and pounded on the door until Byram Keene came out pulling his coat on, and he asked no questions because that was the man he had become. They went up the gulch together with a lantern between them and the whole slope running water in the dark. They heard Corbin before they found the crack, a young man's voice gone ragged and thin, calling into a mountain that gave him nothing back. Minta did not go charging to the edge. Everything Orrin had driven into her held her feet where they were. She set the lantern down, and she sounded the lip first in the dark, by feel and by the bright striking end of a dead man's bar, working out from the mouth until she found rock that rang instead of thudded. Only then did she drive her anchors, 2 of them, well back from the edge and apart. The way she had been taught the winter, a misset spike had dropped her 4 feet and torn her hand. She rigged a line she would not have to talk herself into trusting. Keene held the head of it and braced his boots. Then she went down to the man who had laughed at her. The slab had come off just as she had told him it would, sheared clean at the seam where rotten rock had parted from sound, a piece the size of a barn door, and it had folded one side of his crude deck and pinned his leg against the far wall. Below him the water had risen to within a few feet of his boots and was still rising. He had no second line. He had no emergency rope. He had thought he needed neither. Minta got a loop under his arms and made it fast before she touched the slab at all, so that whatever the rock did next, the boy could not fall. Then she worked the slab, an inch at a time, with the pry bar in her shoulder, and the cold patience Orrin had spent a winter teaching her, while the water came up and the freed rock groaned and Corbin bit down on his own sleeve and did not scream any more. When the leg came loose, she called up to Keene, and the 2 of them hauled, Keene on the line above, Minta guiding the boy off the broken deck and past the wet face that had nearly killed him, and they brought Del Corbin up out of a grave he had dug for himself by believing the shape of a thing was the whole of it. His leg mended. He did not laugh at her again, and neither did anyone else who heard how it went, and the lesson traveled up and down that gulch faster than any success could have carried it, that the crack was not the thing. The work was the thing. The knowing was the thing. A warm hole in the ground was a promise the mountain made, and then broke whenever it pleased, and only the person who understood exactly why it held could tell, on any given night, whether it still would. Del Corbin himself became the strangest proof of it. A lesser humbling might have driven him off the mountain. This one turned him into her most careful hand. When his leg would bear him again, he came to her with his hat off and asked to be taught properly from the sounding up, and she taught him, because Orrin had once taught a girl who arrived with a bad splice, and no more right to be trusted than Corbin had. Within a year, Del Corbin could ring a wall and read it near as true as she could, and the two of them sounded half the cracks in that gulch together, and he never once led a family down a hole he had not tested twice. After that, they stopped coming to Minta to ask about warmth. They came to ask her to sound their rock. She had become, without a title and without meaning to, the one person on that mountain whose word on a crack was the difference between a shelter and a tomb, and she carried it the way Orrin had carried it, plainly, refusing to make it sound easy, turning no one away. It was in the settling weeks after the melt, with the gulch running clear and the aspens coming green, that Ellery Knott first climbed the slope to find her. He was 22, a telegraph line repairman who kept the wire alive between the camps and read the weather instruments at the little station below Ironton because no one else wanted the chore. He was not a large man, and he did not say much, and he came up the hill with a folded paper in his hand and an awkwardness that had nothing to do with the climb. "They tell me you've got shelters up and down this gulch now," he said. "Places people mean to run to when it turns bad." He held out the paper. It was a week of readings in a careful hand, the barometer, the wind, the falling and the rising of the cold. "The wire gets the warnings the day before the weather does, sometimes two." He looked at the crack, and then at her, and then at his boots. "Seemed to me a person building places for folks to run to might want to know when to send them running, before it's on top of you, not after." Minta looked at the readings and then at the young man who had thought of the one thing none of her students had thought of, that a refuge is only as good as the warning that fills it in time. And she understood that he had walked up a mountain to hand her a gift and dressed it, the way everyone on that mountain dressed a gift, as a practical matter of no particular feeling. "You'd bring these up," she said, "regular." "If it'd help?" A pause. It would help. She took the paper. It was the beginning of a thing neither of them named for a long while, because naming it was not how that country worked, but it began there, on the slope above the fissure, with a week of weather in a careful hand. He came up regular after that, once a week, and then more, and the readings in his careful hand became part of the system without either of them calling it that. When the glass fell hard and the wire carried a cold warning down out of the north, Ellery Knott climbed the gulch, and Minta Dyer sent word to the marked refuges, and families that would once have been caught flat-footed had a day's grace to lay in wood and water and get their children near a sound crack. Between the two of them, her map of warm places and his day-ahead sky, the cold lost a great deal of the advantage it had held over that mountain since before either of them was born. They worked well together. They said little about it. It suited them both. By the first anniversary of the night her father died, Minta Dyer was 16 turning 17, and she was no longer the girl the boarding house had turned out into the snow. She had a mentor in the ground and his tools in her hands. She had a network of sound cracks up and down the gulch that the cold could no longer empty of people, and a young man bringing her the sky's warnings a day ahead, and a camp that sounded its rock on her word. She had proved the thing could be done and taught that the doing was a discipline and not a trick, and she had learned in a wet May the last and hardest part of mastery, which is knowing when to walk away from your own good work. She had everything except the one thing Merritt Sloane still meant to take from her, because the claim had not gone away. It had only gone quiet, the way Sloane went quiet, waiting for a better light. And that spring, with the melt spent and the ground firm enough for a surveyor's chain, word came up the gulch that the company had filed at the county seat to prove the fissure, and every warm foot of ground around it belonged to Merritt Sloane and the men behind him, and that there would be a hearing, and that Minta Dyer would have to stand up in a county courtroom and prove that the grave she had built her life in was hers. The hearing was set for the county courthouse in Ouray in the last week of summer, and on paper it was not a fair fight. On one side stood a mining company with money behind it, and a lawyer come up from Denver, filing to prove that the fissure and the warm ground around it had always belonged to it. On the other stood a girl not yet 17, an orphan with a dead father's tools and 40 cents to her name a year before, who had no lawyer, no deed, and no education past what a mine carpenter had taught her in the evenings. Merritt Sloane had chosen his ground the way he chose everything, carefully. A claim contest was decided by papers and by men who understood papers, and Minta Dyer had spent her life learning to read rock, not law. But she had learned one thing from Orrin Paddock that served in a courthouse as well as it served underground. You do not argue with what a thing might be. You measure what it is, and you write the measurement down, and you make the other man argue with the number. She spent the weeks before the hearing the way her father would have spent them, not praying and not fretting, but measuring. Ellery brought his year of readings, and she brought her year of tallies, and they sat at Lida's kitchen table night after night, matching date to date, the nights the cold had come, and the souls who had been out of its reach when it did. Keene, who understood how a court heard a thing, told her what to say, and more useful, what not to. Not to argue that she was owed anything, only to lay out what was true and let the truth do the arguing. She was afraid. She would have been a fool not to be, and Orrin had taught her that fear was only information, a thing to measure and set beside the rest of the facts. So she measured it and set it down and went to Ouray anyway. She did not go alone. Byram Keene took 2 days' wages in lost time and rode down to testify, and he was the kind of witness a court believes. A company foreman, a man with no love for the girl and every reason to side with his own employer. He set his hat on his knee and told the court, in the flat voice of a man reciting a measurement, that he had spent the worst night the district had ever seen digging through a snow plug at the mouth of that crack, certain he was digging out 3 bodies, and that when he had called down into the dark, a living voice had answered him. He said that on the same night, in the company's own bunkhouse, with a stove and 4 walls and a roof, men had near frozen around a cold firebox. Then he said the thing that cost him, because it was set against the company that paid him, that he had called the girl a fool the whole winter long, out loud, to anyone who would listen, and that he had been wrong, and that a man who would not say so under oath was not worth swearing in. Leda Rourke came and held up her hand for the court to see the 2 fingertips the cold had taken, and told them plainly that she would give the other 8 before she would say a word against the crack that had kept her and a hurt boy alive when the wind had erased the whole world between 2 buildings. Matty Crow came on his crooked ankle and told in a boy's careful voice how he had been lowered into the ground on a rope by a girl who then gave him the only warm water she had and put him between 2 bodies to keep his heart going. The married man from up the gulch came. So did the widower whose cellar Minta had refused, who told the court that she had turned him down flat and then found him a better place and sounded it herself before she would let his daughters near it, and that the builder who would not lie to a desperate man to make him feel better was the only builder in that district he would ever trust again. And Del Corbin came and told the court, to his own shame, and without once looking away from it, exactly what happened to a man who copied the shape of Minta Dyer's work and left out the substance. He rolled up his trouser leg and showed them where the slab had pinned him, and he said that the girl he had laughed at had come up the gulch in the dark to pull him out of the grave he had dug by not listening to her, and that he would carry the limp and the lesson together to the end of his days. And Ellery Knott came with his records. That was the thing Sloane's Denver lawyer had not counted on, that the weather itself had been written down. Ellery had a year of readings in his careful hand, the barometer and the wind and the cold, dated and ordered, and beside them, in Minta's hand, the dates the refugees had been filled and the number of souls in each. The court could lay the two records side by side and see in plain figures the nights the mountain had tried to kill people and the people it had failed to kill. You could argue with a girl. It was harder to argue with a column of dead men who had failed to die. Sloane's Denver lawyer tried once to make the girl the issue instead of the ground. He asked Minta on the stand how old she had been when she started this business, and she said 16, and he asked whether a child of 16 was truly fit to judge sound rock from bad, and whether it was not simple luck that had kept her breathing. Minta did not rise to it. She told him plainly that luck did not line up charcoal marks across 3 stole joints for a year without one of them moving, and that if he wished to test whether it was luck or knowing, she would take him up the gulch that afternoon and put the bar in his hand and let him tell the court which walls would hold and which would fall on him. The lawyer did not accept the invitation. At the back of the room, the 3 Denver men exchanged a look, and one of them wrote something down. Minta's own case was 3 facts, and she laid them out the way she laid out a descent, one sound anchor at a time. The first fact was the tally. Oren's copied page, with Sloane's own signature at the bottom, showing that every timber she had used had been struck off the company's books as worthless waste 18 months before she touched it. A company could not sell a man his own garbage back to him, and it could not, she said, declare a thing worthless when a girl needed it and precious when she had proved what it was worth. The second fact was the ground itself. No working of the company came within reach of the fissure. No survey had ever been filed, no claim staked, no assessment work done until the day Minta Dyer went down that crack and came up alive and made the whole district look at it. The warm breath the company now called a mineral indication was a seep of warm water through altered rock, and she could prove it, because she had measured it every day for a year, and it had never once thrown anything but warmth and damp. It was not a load. It was a place the earth happened to breathe, and no man had wanted it until a girl gave it a value it had not had before. And value a person makes with her own hands, she said, is not a thing another man gets to file a paper on after the fact. The third fact was a dead man's wages. She had saved it for last, the way Oren had taught her to drive the final wedge, only when the others were seated. In the autumn of 1898, she told the court, Clement Dyer had died under a company roof resetting company timber, and the company had closed his account and buried him and ruled a line under his name, and it had never paid the wages he was owed for the work he did in the weeks before the roof came down. It had held them against debts a dying man had run up on credit at the company store, and it had turned his daughter out of a boarding house it partly owned rather than settle what it owed him. She did not ask the court to make her rich. She asked it to make the company pay a dead carpenter what a dead carpenter had earned, and to let her keep the ground she had made valuable with the only inheritance he had left her, which was his hands and his eye and his way of marking a line so it could be read in the dark. She said all of it without her voice breaking, because Oren had taught her that a number spoken plain carries further than a number spoken through tears, and because she had already cried for her father a year before, alone in a powder shed, and had no crying left to spend on a courtroom. But she set her father's name down in that room like a stole-seated true, and every person in it felt the load come onto it and hold. The room was quiet when she finished, and it was not the quiet of a girl who had been humored. Sloane's lawyer did what lawyers do, and it did not matter, because the men who mattered in that room were not the lawyer and were not the judge. They were 3 Denver men in good coats sitting at the back, the men whose money stood behind the company's paper, and they had come to see an asset defended and were watching instead their company try to take a warm hole in the ground away from an orphan who had used it to keep children alive through a killing winter. They were businessmen. They could read a room and a district and a newspaper. And what they saw, laid out in Ellery Knott's dated columns and Byram Keene's flat, honest voice, and a widower's 2 small daughters, was that Merritt Sloane had found them the one fight no amount of being legally right could win. Sloane knew it too. He was not a stupid man. He had only ever had one blindness. When the recess came, he stood in the courthouse hall and looked at Minta with something that was almost respect and entirely bitter. "The crack was worthless," he said, "until you made people believe otherwise. That's all you did. You didn't find gold in it. You just made them believe it was worth having, and now I'm to lose it for the telling of a good story." It was Byram Keene who answered him, because Keene had been on Sloane's side of that argument for a whole winter and had climbed all the way to the other side of it with a shovel in his hands. "No," Keene said. "The crack stayed a crack. It never changed. The work had value, the sounding, and the timber set true, and the knowing when to go down and when to walk away. That's what she made, and it was worth having before you ever noticed it, and it'll be worth having after you're gone. That's the part you never could see, Sloane. You kept looking at the ground for something to be worth money. She looked at it for something to keep people alive. Only one of you was right, and it wasn't the one with the ledger." There was a night's wait for the ruling, and Minta spent it not in worry, but in the plain company of the people who had come down the mountain for her. They took rooms at a boarding house in Ouray, and Lita cooked because she could not sit still otherwise, and Keene played cards badly and lost cheerfully, and Ellery sat close and said nothing, and it was enough. Minta had done all the measuring there was to do. The number was on the table now, out of her hands, and a person who has set her timber true learns to sleep the night before the load goes on, because worry drives no wedge and seats no stall. She slept. In the morning, the court gave its ruling. The hearing ended the way real things end, without a thunderclap. The claim was denied. The court found no mineral lode, no filed claim, no working within reach, and it would not hand a company a patent on warm ground it had ignored until an orphan gave it a name. Minta was left in possession of the fissure and granted the right to hold it, in the plain, modest way such things were granted, more a matter of no one being able to prove it was not hers than of a grand deed with a seal. And the company was ordered to pay the wages of Clement Dyer, with the debts he had run up on his deathbed set against them, so that what she walked out with was not a fortune. It was a little over $200 and a piece of ground the whole district had once called a grave. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the exact size of justice that country ever handed anyone, and she took it with both hands. Resonance. She stood on the courthouse steps in Ouray with $200 of her father's earned wages in an envelope against her chest, and for the first time since a brass room key had gone cold in her palm the winter before, she was not bracing against the next blow. Her father had marked his measuring line so it could be read in the dark, and she had read it all the way down through a killing winter and a mentor's death and a flood and a courtroom, and it had led her here to a step in the late summer sun with the ground beneath her finally, plainly her own. He had left her 40 cents and a chest of tools and a way of seeing. It had turned out to be an inheritance no roof could bury. Word of the ruling went up the grade ahead of her, the way word always traveled in that country, and when Minta rode back into the camp, the people who had once sung a coffin song after her came out to the road. No one made a speech. That was not how they did things there. But the little coffin that had swung from the laundry sign a year before had a way of being remembered by everyone and named by no one. And in its place, without a word spoken to mark the change, the camp had begun to call the fissure not Dyer's grave room, but Dyer's ground, two words different, and the whole distance between a joke and a landmark. She had gone down into it a girl they were waiting to bury. She had come back up the owner of it in the eyes of the county and in the eyes of the only people whose opinion had ever actually cost her anything. Merritt Sloan did not last the year in the district. The Denver men did not punish him, because men like that are not punished, only moved. They eased him out quietly, the way a company sheds a thing that has become a liability on the books, and he went down to some other camp to keep some other ledger, and the mountain did not miss him. He had not been a monster. He had been a column of figures that never learned to add up a life, and in the end the figures went against him, and that was all. Minta never saw him again, and thought of him less than he might have supposed. Byram Keene stayed, which told you the difference between the two men better than anything either of them ever said. He worked that district until his knees gave out, and every green hand who came up green got the same speech from him, that there was a girl on this mountain who could read rock better than any engineer the company had ever sent up from Denver, that he had called her a fool once to her face, and that being wrong out loud and admitting it had turned out to be the most useful thing he ever did. He and Minta were never friends exactly. They were something the frontier made more often than friends, which was two people who had been on opposite sides of a hard question and come out the far end of it with a respect that needed no fondness to hold its weight. She married Ellery Knott the following spring, in the plain way of that country, with Lita standing up for her and Keene giving her away because there was no one else, and he had earned the right. They were married in the little church at Ironton, with the gulch running spring loud outside the windows, and Ellery, who never spent 3 words where one would do, said his vows and then leaned close and told her, so that only she could hear, that he had read the glass that morning and the weather would hold clear for the whole of the day. It was the most romantic thing he knew how to say, and she understood it exactly, and she laughed out loud in that church for the first time in her life, and Lida wept. And Keene stood at the back with the look of a man who had misplaced something long ago and found it, against all odds, in an unexpected pocket. It was not a courtship anyone would have written a song about, which suited them both, because they had already made a song of the thing that mattered. His day-ahead sky and her map of warm places, working together to take from the cold the advantage it had held over that mountain since before either of them was born. He read the weather, and she read the rock, and between the two of them they built something neither could have built alone. They understood each other the way two people understand each other when they have spent a year handing each other the exact tool that was needed without being asked. There was a night early in their marriage that stood for all the rest of it. The glass fell through the afternoon, and Ellery took a reading he did not like and walked the 4 miles up the gulch in the failing light to tell her the cold was coming faster than the wire had said. They did not argue about it, and they did not waste the dark. She took the upper refugees, and he took the lower, and they went from mouth to mouth in the rising wind, lighting the way for families who had learned to move when the two of them said move, checking each dry cache, sounding each nervous wall one more time by lantern. By the time the storm came down in earnest, there was not a soul on that stretch of mountain who was not out of its reach, and the two of them met back at their own door near midnight, snow to the knee, too cold and too spent to say much, and did not need to. That was the whole of their romance, and it was a great deal more than most people ever get. The work grew past the gulch. In the years that followed, the marked refuges spread the length of the high country between Ironton and the Red Mountain camps. Sound cracks and dry adits and reinforced cellars, each one sounded and planned and checked, each one flying its pale strip of cloth on a pole so a person running blind could find the mouth, each one holding a stoppered bottle of matches and hard bread and a knotted rope. Minta Dyer taught the sounding of rock to anyone who would stand for the lesson, and she taught it hard, and she buried no students. Del Corbin became her partner in it and ran the lower district when she could not. Mattie Crow grew up telling the true story and grew old still telling it. Winters came that would have emptied the camps of the dying in the years before, and did not, because a girl the district had once fitted for a coffin had spent her life making sure the mountain had fewer and fewer people it could reach. She had children, and taught them to sound a wall before they could properly read, and they thought nothing of it, because to them a mother who could tell a live rock from a dead one by the ring of a bar was simply a mother, the way all children take the marvel of their parents for granted. There was a winter, some years on, that the old-timers would set beside 1899 when they wanted to frighten the young, a February that came down hard and stayed, the wire warning of it 2 full days ahead, the way Ellery's wire always did now. In the camps up that gulch, not one person died of the cold that month. They went to the marked places when the flagpoles said go, and they came out again when it broke, and it had become so ordinary by then that no one thought to call it a miracle, which was the exact measure of what Minta Dyer had made. The miracle had turned into the routine. That is the rarest thing a person can do with a hard-won idea, and she had done it without ever once appearing to try. The idea traveled further than she ever did. Men and women who had learned to sound rock at her shoulder carried the knowing with them when the ore played out, to the coal camps, to the railroad grades, to other high cold places where people had always simply endured the winter and buried the ones it took. Mattie Crow, grown and married and wearing his limp like a decoration, ran a freight line through 3 counties and marked a sound refuge at every hard stretch of the road, and told every driver he hired the story of the night a girl had lowered him into the ground on a rope and would not let the cold have him. None of them called it the Dyer method because it never had a name. It was only the right way to do a thing, passed hand to hand the way her father had passed it to her, over a winds when she was 10 years old. But it was hers. Every warm, sound place a frightened person ever ran to in that country, for 2 generations after, had a 16-year-old girl somewhere behind it, kneeling in the snow over a hole the whole world had told her was a grave. The boom did not last, because booms never do. The ore played out, as ore does, and the silver price never came back the way the camps prayed it would, and through the early years of the new century the high district began to empty. The bunkhouses closing, the wagons going down the grade loaded and not coming back up, the great machinery falling silent on the peaks. The town that had hung a coffin on a laundry sign to mock a girl thinned out and, in time, mostly blew away the way those places did. The laundry burned in a winter no one troubled to record and was not rebuilt. The boarding house that had turned a girl out into the snow stood empty a few years and then fell in on itself under the weight of an ordinary storm, the kind of storm a sound refuge would have laughed at. The road grew over. The mountain took the town back the way it took everything back, without malice and without hurry. But the marked cracks remained, up and down the high country, their flagpoles gone to gray rags, and then to nothing, their timber holding still in the cold dark, long after the last person who knew why it had been set there had gone down the grade for good. But the knowledge did not blow away. It had never lived in the town. It had lived in her hands and in the hands of the people she taught, and it went where they went, down off the mountain and out into a wider country. The sounding of rock and the setting of timber and the reading of air, and beneath all of it, the one hard lesson that outlasted every camp she ever knew, that the earth is always trying to tell you whether it will hold you, and that the whole of survival is learning to listen and being honest about what you hear and knowing the exact hour to walk away. She grew old the way few people in that hard country were ever allowed to grow old, slowly and in her own house, among people who owed her more than they could say and mostly did not try. Strangers came sometimes, having heard the story third hand and gotten it wrong, expecting a hard old woman or a plaster saint, and found instead someone who wanted to talk about drainage and air and the ring of a good wall, and who would, if you sat still for it, teach you to sound rock at her kitchen table with a spoon and a countertop until you began dimly to hear the difference between a live surface and a dead one. She never tired of the teaching. It was the only monument she ever wanted, and she built it one person at a time to the end. Late in her life, when the camps were mostly gone and the road up to the old prospect had grown over, she had Del Corbin, gray himself by then, rig the descent one more time, and she went down into the fissure that had made her, slow on the ladder now, but sure of every rung. The deck was still there. The stalls still stood. She laid her old hand flat against the sound eastern wall the way her father had taught her and Orrin after him, and she sounded it once with the bright bar, and it rang as true as it had the first hard winter of her life. Then she climbed back out into the daylight and did not go down again, because she had learned long ago and at great cost the exact hour to walk away from her own good work. Minta Dyer Knott lived a long life, longer than the district that made her, and she kept Orrin Paddock's sounding bar to the end of it, and the striking end never once went to rust. She left a stretch of mountain where, for a generation, the cold could not do what it always had, because a network of warm, sounded places stood ready, a pale flag at every mouth, a day's warning coming down the wire ahead of every storm. She left a way of seeing the ground that traveled far past the gulch, carried by everyone she made stand for the hard questions before she would trust them near a crack. And she left the plain proof, worth more than any load Sloane ever dreamed the crack might hold, that a thing the world calls worthless can be made to keep people alive, if someone will learn it honestly, build it true, and refuse to make it sound easy. She left her own long life, too, as the answer to the question the camp had shouted at her when she was 16 and freezing and alone. She had gone into the ground with 40 cents and a dead man's tools, come out again and again through the worst the mountain could send, grown old above that same ground, and been buried at last in the fullness of her years, beside a husband who read the sky and near a mentor who read the stone. She was not remembered as the girl who slept in a grave. She was remembered as the woman who read rock, whose word on a crack was the difference between a shelter and a tomb, and who never once sent a soul down a hole she had not sounded true. Go back one last time to the killing winter of it, to a girl of 16 dragging a 6-inch pole through the snow toward a black slot in the ground, the whole camp watching from the road, a timberman's cruel line trailing her like the children's song. She's building furniture for her own grave. They were certain of it, and not wrongly. A girl choosing to sleep in an untested crack in the teeth of a Colorado winter, with no proof the ground would do anything but close over her, was reckless past the edge of sense, and they buried her in a joke because it was kinder than watching her die. But the ground did not close over her. She had asked it the questions her father taught her, measured its answers, and set her timber true, and it held her through the night the district still remembers, and every night after, and it was never once a grave. Down there on the eastern wall, on the sound rock where the warm seam breathes, 3 charcoal marks still line up true across the joints of 3 offset skulls, not moved a hair through avalanche or flood or the passing of everyone who doubted her. And past them, faint and steady and going the way it has always gone, a thin, warm current rises up through the dark of the crack, unhurried, toward the far small circle of daylight above.